This is Dan Schneider on this Dan Schneider video interview. The subject is Krazy Kat, a classic American comic strip by George Herriman. I'll be speaking with two experts about it. The subject is Krazy Kat, a classic American comic strip from the early 20th century by George Herriman, and I have two men who will be discussing it and its import still today in the 21st century. On the bottom of the screen, you see Tom Lennon. On the top of the screen, you see David Carrier. As I usually like to do, I want to give my guests a chance to tell a little bit about themselves before we get started. So, David, if you could give a little background about who you are, what you do, and your interest in Krazy Kat.
Sure. I am by training and academic background a philosopher. I did philosophy of art, and by stages I moved, in the 1980s into art criticism. And then I got interested in comics, and in fact did a book, good Lord, year 2000 that appeared on comics. And of course got interested in Krazy. I mean, once you start to look at comics, you're inevitably going to look at that. And at the time, I mean, and this, the dating is, I think, relevant here. I was surprised that, on one hand, Krazy was really famous. I mean, everyone had loved him and had been a bit older literature, but there was no bio of Harriman himself. And in fact, even to find the published materials was a little difficult. And when I talked to the publisher, I was one in Western Massachusetts, there'd been two tries to do the complete Krazy, publishing it, and neither had quite worked. And I guess it was a financial problem that there simply wasn't this market. But I was quite surprised that something that's so famous, you see, because if you're an art critic, any artist with a modest reputation, not just the Matisses and the Cezannes, but the down low, will have a catalog recently, will have literature and so forth. But Krazy didn't. And that fascinated me. Okay, so I did my book on comics. And since then, a couple of things have happened. One is that more people in art history seem to be interested in comics. It's part of a general crossover into other media. And the other thing is that, of course, there's the biography of Harriman. And recently there have been other things published. I mean, I reviewed one of them, a massive book. I think it was $200, one of the big German publishers of the Sunday versions of Krazy. So there seems to be, for all kinds of political reasons, a change in interest. And this very last thing is, if you look at the present art world, and I've thought about this a lot, what's happened in the past, well, since COVID? The most amazing change, which very hard to understand, and really a very good change, is the prominence of Black artists, Black critics, and so forth. This is really astonishing. I never expected this. And of course, Harriman would fit into this world perfectly. So a lot of things have changed in 25 years.
Yeah. Not to mention the gender fluidity of Krazy Kat, him or herself.
Yeah,
Yeah.
sure.
So, Tom Lennon, if you could give similar who you are, what you do, and how you got started on Krazy Kat.
Okay, yeah, my gateway introduction to Krazy Kat. Firstly, yeah, my name's Tom Lennon. I'm a freelance writer. I'm born in Ireland, raised in England, living in Mexico. I'm not an academic, but I approach it as somebody who writes about comics. Love Krazy Kat. I was introduced to Krazy Kat around about 25 years ago, possibly the tail end of the 1990s, and I encountered a collected volume at a library, and the cover caught my eye, and I've been gorging on Krazy Kat ever since. It's one of my favorite things to do on a Sunday, is to just browse through Krazy Kat Sunday comics from a century ago, and it just puts me in a wonderful space. It's great stuff. It's timeless. I find that over the 25 years-ish I've been reading Krazy Kat, new layers reveal themselves to you continuously as topics come up in the news. You realize, oh my God, Herriman was writing about this a century ago. So yeah, I find it's an eternal well of and a beautiful, timeless classic that I can go back to time and time again. So yeah, it's great. I had fun writing about it, and I plan to write about it again because it's there's so much to see in there.
So let's talk about Krazy Kat. Before we get into Harriman and biographical stuff, let's talk just about Krazy Kat just in general. We can talk about specific themes and that sort of stuff, particularly famous strips too. It seems to me that Krazy Kat, when I think came along, what, 1913 or something, and it was the understrip of a more well-known strip at the time. And when I look at Krazy Kat and you look at Ignatz Mouse and then Officer Pup, even though those relationships evolved from the beginning, it seems to me that putting aside comic strips, it had a huge influence on cartoons. I mean, I can't think of Tom and Jerry without Krazy Kat. You can't think of the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote without Krazy Kat. You can't think of Felix the Cat or the early Disney, the Disney stuff with the rubbery arms and just the black and white. It seems to me that not only within the comic strip itself, the comic strip world, Krazy Kat within the animated world or the drawn world has a tremendous influence. Yet I've never really seen a lot of people make connections to Felix or to Disney or to Roadrunner or to Tom and Jerry. Am I missing something? Either one of you want to jump in on that?
I'm pretty sure. Sorry, Dave, do you want to say something? Or I was because I know Chuck Jones was very definitely influenced by Herriman, and I'm sure I don't have it immediately to hand, but I mean Roadrunner is clearly. I mean, I always think of Colin Kelly, a character from the dealer of bricks in Krazy Kat. It would provide Ignatz Kat, and we'll talk about the whole brick dynamic shortly, I'm sure. But Colin Kelly, the supplier of bricks, I always think of as a forerunner to the Acme Company, who provided Wile E. Coyote with somewhat ineffective death traps. And that whole dynamic, the whole background, the background of the Roadrunner cartoons is very Herriman. That choice, David.
I think if anything, you see, Krazy was so famous that it was all around the culture. And I mean, what I mentioned, in the literature, there's this kind of delay. The two things I think that are important right here. First is that you mentioned, Dan, about the business of when the Krazy Kat first appeared. And it's very interesting because he's sort of nothing. He's at the bottom of one of those other strips, and then suddenly it's full blown. And you see, I think if you look at him and also you look at the other comics artists, it was a strange situation because on one hand, there were a lot of people who'd gone to art school and studied, drawing and were prepared to do it. But to come up with a successful strip, you needed a sort of device that would work. And the triad dog cat of Harriman worked, but obviously a lot of people found things that didn't work. And the second thing maybe related to this is that, in a lot of strips, Dick Tracy and so forth, when the originator died, they farmed it out. They had someone else do it. And if you think about it in the art world, this would be quite peculiar. It would be as if saying, well, Picasso's dead, but we have his son or his daughter. They could keep making Picassos. But with Herriman, it was clear that that was it, that there wasn't any way anyone could pick. It was just too individual and too personal. But, we should mention, and I'll stop here, about the fame, that my understanding is because the newspaper man, Citizen Kane, what's his name?
Chuck.
That he liked it, that it wasn't so popular with all the editors. Yeah. So peculiar kind of bit about this reception.
The Hearst thing, interesting, sorry.
No, go ahead, Tom.
I was going to say, the Hearst thing, William Randolph Hearst, Citizen Kane. I was, funny enough, introducing my wife to the lady from Shanghai last night. I'm a huge Wells fan.
Oh, yeah, that end monologue in the mirrors. I love you both. Boom, boom. I'm an
Irishman. I'm an Irishman, and hearing, I love Orson Welles, but his attempt at an Irish accent was making my wife cringe. Not one of his greatest strengths. I love the voice, but he had limits. But yeah, Wells, of course, played Charlie Kane in Citizen Kane, who was based on William Randolph Hearst. And Hearst, it's an interesting thing because he was very much protected, the Krazy Kat, because he loved this comic strip. Now, this is a guy who he was very much the kind of Rupert Murdoch of his day. He was kind of a contentious figure. He was this kind of synonymous with quote unquote yellow press and provoking wars with countries, with provocative news stories that would be deemed fake news nowadays.
Well, he famously said during the Cuba thing, you provide the men, I'll provide the war, or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah. That kind of, and you provide, you provide photos, I'll provide the prose poems. I think was the Kane line, but was clearly alluding to this thing. Yet he had this soft spot for Krazy Kat, and as the strip became more esoteric over time, and as the popularity drained, and as David was saying, local editors were trying to hide this strip away, and they were constantly saying, look, we don't want to publish this. It was Hearst who would veto them and would say, no, you may be putting it in the arts pages instead of with the funnies, but he protected, he was like a benefactor, and he gave Herriman a kind of artistic carte blanche in a way. That's rare. But there was a relationship there between Herriman and Hearst, though I think is interesting.
The downside of it was that business that, if he wanted to go on vacation, he had to draw ahead. That is, he couldn't say, well, I'm going up to the Valley, New Mexico for a month. He'd say, well, but we want to see those. So it really was a treadmill to keep going.
That's true. But the other one last thing about Hearst and that kind of benefactor relationship, I think it's interesting. When Herriman died in 1944, Hearst said, that's it with Krazy Kat. He could not imagine anybody else. And that wasn't the norm. When Seeger died, Popeye strips continued. It wasn't the norm that like this is a Herriman thing. Nobody else can touch it. And it's a bit like Waterman with Calvin and Hobbes. You can't imagine anybody else. It's a very much a personal.
Whereas maybe with Dick Tracy, other people could do it, or Superman.
Yeah. Well, absolutely.
Well, most of the comics of the day were either a little bit of humor, or they were these soap operas. Mary Worth, Mark Trail, Dondi. That came a little bit later, Dondi, but Gasoline Alley and all that. These were following characters. I mean, they were basically soap operas before soap operas on radio.
Yeah. Sorry, David. I was going to say that, of course, and David touched on this with, Krazy was born in one of those soap opera strips. It was The Family Upstairs, or The Dingbat Family, it was originally called, and that was a Herriman strip set in a tenement building about a family constantly, there's a family always unseen who live in a tenement upstairs, and the cat and the mouse just started appearing at the bottom of the strip as a bit of blank space. And that became a strip underneath, running parallel to. But go on, David, yeah.
And the thing that I would add to that is that the sociology is pretty clear that at the turn of the 20th century, you had a lot of newspaper readers with weak English, and the comics were perfect because the combination of word and image meant that these could then go. When I did my book, I thought about this, and I remember way back in the 1970s when I would travel on trains in Italy, and you would see adults reading comics, not the American ones, but reading, like there would be the comic strip versions of classic novels. Dante or whatever. But I mean, that makes sense in a culture. In other words, people, their language is a little shaky in reading, and so they get a comic version, and that's easier. So that's all in the background here of Krazy.
Before I move on, I just want to throw out one other thing that I don't know has gotten as much discussion or writing over the years regarding Krazy Kat. But Krazy Kat came along in 1913. 1 year later, Chaplin comes along. And I think when you look at Chaplin, he's a very human, like the Tramp at least, is a very human like equivalent of some of the elements of Krazy Kat, some of the nastiness of Ignatz. And how many shoes, how many bricks, how many whatever were thrown at the Tramp character, especially in his shorts. Let me start with you, Tom. Has anyone ever picked up on that and compared Krazy Kat as a sort of precursor to silent film comedians in general, but certainly Chaplin?
There is crossover there. It's interesting because Herman knew some of these people. I think later in his career, he set up a studio at the Hal Roach studio, I think, when he was back in LA. So, of course, he'd been in the bullpen when he was working in New York with, all the various other journalists and cartoonists. Moved to LA, and I'm sure it was in LA where he was working in the Hal Roach studio. And I know during Laurel and Hardy, during their silent era, there's a clear reference to Krazy Kats, where there's a character dressed as a mouse who throws a brick at either Stan or Ollie. Again, my knowledge of silent slapstick isn't as solid as it used to be, but there are references and there is some kind of cross-pollination there. And I know I've read Herriman review Chaplin, and there are Herriman often in the style of Krazy, because he was very good at deflecting and personal questions or not writing in his own voice. He would often write in a comedic, self-effacing voice. But yeah, there are connections with Chaplin, and Chaplin was certainly on Herriman's radar, and as was, to everyone else as well. But whether Chaplin was influenced by, I can see though the missiles of affection being thrown at the Tramp as well. So David, any?
Think of all those newspapers that he was on. I mean, anyone would envy that kind of hundreds of newspapers, and it keeps going. I mean, one of the funnier details about this is I have somewhere in my study here a catalog of a German show a few years ago who did American comics, including Herriman, and I thought, oh wow, they have to translate that English kind of funny English. What would that mean to the German audiences? At the same time, you see, the peculiar thing about fame, and this relates to the question I have that you may know more, is that, okay, the strips appeared in the newspaper, and so you could see them there. I've never found anything, and you may correct me, where Herriman saved the originals. In a sense, you made the template and you printed it, and then you didn't keep that. And so you can go on eBay now and you can buy old newspapers. I remember I did that, and they were still cheap. But I mean, it meant that the simple thing of a kind of record of the career just wasn't there. There was one interesting case in New York. There was an art gallery that found all kinds of painters who were inspired by Herriman and did a show about that. But it's sort of revealing that all these features of Herriman are the fact that he's in this special world. He's got an enormous audience, but the material you see wasn't preserved. There was no one who, apart from the people if they were saving the newspapers, there was no one who said, well, let's do Herriman 1922, 1923, and the way that a successful painter would be seen.
Well, that naturally segues to E. Cummings, who was a poet and painter. If both or one of you wants to talk about Cummings and what his place in the whole Krazy Kat thing is.
That about Cummings himself, I don't know. I mean, again, it was such fame. He was written about. There's the guy in the 1920s who writes about popular art. Cummings himself, I don't know. I think, see, my sense is that it's sort of looking at it from the academic side is that the whole business sort of fell through the cracks because if it had been, again, if he'd been a painter, he would have been talked about a lot, but he wasn't. If he'd been a composer, he would have felt, but I mean, he fell into this mass culture. And when I started, and I think it's changed, a lot of the writing was about sociology. That is, what does this express? And there's, of course, endless discussions about Krazy and race, which I read with interest, but I think they're so hard to pin down because it's such a crazy story. I mean, a creature that likes to be hit with a brick from a mouse, you say, well, I don't know where you're going to take that. It's so simple.
Well, I mean, Crazy Cat is mostly black, if not all black, and Ignatz is white. So, I mean, there's that kind of visual dichotomy right there.
Yeah.
And an ineffectual officer pup, basically. Look in the last how many years. I mean, that's quite relevant here. The constabulary here in the U.S. at least with black people.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, Harriman always asked and had that thing which it sounds like a joke. He said, well, he always kept his hat on. So that side of it, I don't know what to know because I have to admit that when I went over a few years ago, this big German version, I spent days going over this book, and it's such a simple story, and yet it has all these endless variations because you feel like saying only 3 characters. I mean, Seinfeld had 4, right? And you said, well, people, they're not even human. But yet it goes and goes, and I laughed, and I would look at it again, and finally I just gave away the book to my daughter. I don't want to keep, because I thought if I have it in the house, I'll keep going back,
You're stronger than me because I do keep going back and I keep revisiting and I keep diving in there. Just to circle back to the Cummings question, Cummings was a big champion of Krazy Kat, and after Harriman died, I'm pretty sure it was Cummings was the driving force behind the first collection and wrote an introduction as well. And I think as well, it's worth remembering that Krazy Kat was written at a time of comic books infancy. So a lot of the kind of prejudices that, we can be subject to ourselves, even I love comics, but I can be a bit defensive about the topic because, it's comics can be terrible, and comics can be sublime,
Yes, I like to joke when I said when I wrote the book on comics, I already had tenure. I mean, if you philosophy department and you say to your colleagues, well, I'm working on epistemology, on ethics. Well, I'm working on comics. And it's kind of,
it's easy to get defensive, and I've had fun, mocking and writing satirical articles about kind of rabid fanboys and things like that. But comics are also magnificent, but it was produced at a time before those prejudices, I suppose, had solidified. It was a new art form. It was finding its feet. It was Krazy Kat ended in 1944, so it ended when Superman was 6 years old. It's worth remembering that the context there. The superhero genre was still in its nappies and its diapers. Sorry. British English peeping in.
Even in a market view, I remember at the time finding that comics were in a kind of ghetto of a bookstore. That is, it would be a separate, the graphic novels were in a separate section. There were those attempts, like particularly most spectacularly with Mouse, to elevate and to try to make graphic novels, into this. And I'm not sure that really came off. I mean, people tried it, and there were very interesting cases, but it's still a separate category of literature now.
Yeah, I think there are things. Yeah, it is respected. You'll find a dedicated section in a bookstore. Some are better than others. you know, and sometimes you've got somebody in a bookstore who knows their comics, knows what the good stuff is, and will promote, you know, the interesting things rather than, you know, just what the latest,
Yeah, sure.
you know. As fond as I am of superheroes, you know, it's you know, there's more to the medium, and it always has been than that.
Oh, but you can't, for example, I think it's sort of ridiculous to have Watchmen listed as one of the top novels as a list did, just the way it's ridiculous to have Bob Dylan get the prize for literature, the Nobel Prize. He's not doing literature, he's making music, and when you have visual art, I mean, the thing about reading is your Captain Ahab will look different than my Captain Ahab, no matter how closely described. And if you don't believe that, they've done studies where they've had people, they've written a description of Marilyn Monroe. Oh, here's a woman or whatnot. And then people, they can't, they'll talk about, oh, well, I thought she had bigger breasts. Everyone will take the same words. Whereas when you have Bruce Wayne or you have Superman, you know, it's Superman.
Yeah, I know, but I mean, my funny example, the only one I've written about recently, is the Proust comic, because for people that don't want to read 3,600 pages now, you could and yet I remember I did a lecture once in art history department. Someone was annoyed at me because you wonder in Proust, if you're reading it, you wonder what the boys and girls look like. They're at the beach, and you see they're funny, naive things, because I never thought this through, but of course. This is 1880s beach in France, and and boys go to the beach with a three-piece suit and a hat. But I mean, there is this. You're right. There is this prejudice against comics, and I don't know, for all of the the champion of it, that's still thought of as this kind of weird, strange. It's still in another place, and I haven't followed this completely, and that makes it hard. You see, I mean, could there be, and I don't know, could there be a big Harriman show at a museum?
Well, there has been, I believe, hasn't there been?
With original drawings, I don't know.
Oh, the originals, okay.
Yeah.
It's difficult because, although saying that it was a nebulous period, and the feelings that we have now, or the attitudes that can sometimes be directed towards comics, weren't in place altogether. It was still, newspaper strips were seen as kind of disposable. They were produced in a bullpen, printed, stuck in a chute, up a vacuum tube, and they'd be got rid of. Harriman's, as far as I know, he did keep a lot of his original artwork, which he would then often paint with a wash and gift to people. So you'll often see, and they're really beautiful. I mean, because he would hand paint his original artwork and gift them to people. So you'll often see in books about Harriman, you'll see these lovely watercolor wash kind of painted illustrations and a little signature, and happy holidays to the ex-family.
Right.
And so he did a lot of that. And so a lot of the Harriman art and original art is stuff that was gifted.
Right.
There's subsequently been, people have found and have, it's been given to collections. But yeah, that's kind of interesting because, I mean, if you think, that was in, we're talking about, between the period from 1913 to 1944. I mean, if you think of the trouble Jack Kirby had getting his artwork back in the late 60s and 1970s, let alone, the organisation, a corporation, would see it as their property.
Right.
So,
well, it's a carbon copy of the music industry, the way it is,
but the fact that one of the interesting things about Harriman, while you're talking about that, it does mean that, unlike I always think of Harriman as a bit kind of like Dickens, there's a Dickensian quality, I think, to Krazy Kat, because all life is there. You can look at it in so many different ways, and there's so as a kind of encyclopedia of the human condition.
Right.
With
I'd actually go back a little further, say Don Quixote.
Okay, yeah. Well, of course, there's a character in Krazy Kat called Don Quixote who is a coyote. So, right, and which again, the lineage to Roadrunner, is there if you look hard enough. But yeah, I think I've lost my train. I was talking about the disposability of the art, and it does mean though that there's always more Herriman to find. There's always, with the daily strip, we've got the Sunday collections, and they're great. And then Fantagraphics, I think it was Taschen was the German company. Yeah, they did this great coffee table. I haven't got it, but I think I need to get a bigger coffee table. But it was a big edition. Fantagraphics have been publishing the Sunday strips, and I think back in the 80s it was Eclipse Comics who went out of business. So they started serializing the Sunday strips. So the Sunday strips have been fairly well represented, but dailies, of course, there's a lot more daily strips than there were Sundays, and they're fiendishly hard to find. I mean, they're out there, but there's still big gaps.
I mean, because this came to me because, again, in my academic mode, when I'm trying to write about it, I did a book about Nicholas Poussin. Well, there are catalog rates and A's, and you can find every Poussin or impossible Poussin and so forth and so on. It's all there. But with the comics, not just with Herriman, but with the others, it's a real mess. And you realize that you don't want to say things like there's no such and such in, there's no example, because it may be that there's just one you haven't found. But the literature, I mean, and this is before all the online business, the literature was, just not collected. I mean, I remember with comics finding that there was a guy in San Francisco who had all this archive in his garage. And I thought, well, this is a different world from going, to the art history library. And all of this you see, and I think what we're toying with here is that this, at bottom, is a kind of prejudice about this sort of art form. At least when I did it, and judging by the biography of Herriman, about a few years ago now, that there wasn't so much discussion. I mean, Picasso's endless. I mean, Picasso just goes and goes and goes. But I mean, Herriman was as famous as Picasso, really, he was. I think even Picasso liked him. I mean, he really was, he wasn't this obscure, easy figure. But is there this kind of commentary? No, not that I could see. Not yet.
Yeah, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think part of the reason for these gaps and part of the reason for is the nature of the beast, is the nature of the publication. They were published in newspapers, and they were published in Hearst newspapers. And Hearst newspapers, I mean, if you think librarians were kind of, would not be rushing to preserve copies of the Yellow Press or provocative tabloid newspapers that are prone to starting wars. They were looking for the New York Times or the Washington Post. And so it was hidden away in what was also, the Hearst papers could be terrible, awful rags, So that kind of almost was a stop to their preservation. The fact that they were hidden away amongst all this kind of tabloid excess. Somewhere in there, where there's little nuggets of gold.
And I think there's another thing that we haven't talked about, which is that my judgment, and my degree, is that Herriman was by miles the best strip. I mean, it's funny because in art history, people argue about who's great, who's not, But when I had a funny sense at the time of then going and looking at minor comics, and the minor comics, they could be really god awful. And there were people in their garage doing it, and oh dear, you should have gone back to art school, So Herriman, he was so spectacularly good, but I mean, he was isolated in that way. And why, I find it very hard to explain why he's so good, because the basic idea, which maybe we should talk about, is really silly. He said, all right, you got these three creatures: the cop, the mouse, and the cat. It's just weird. It doesn't. It looks. Someone presented that on a sheet of paper to the editor. You could see she would say, "Well, this is not going to go anywhere. This is really, come back with something complicated, right?" And yet, what he did.
Yeah, and that dynamic, and it's worth stressing. Okay, it's weird. Okay, so you've got a cat who's a bit naive, to say the least. You've got this cat who is prone to, who talks in a patois that's very idiosyncratic. It's full of, it's a beautiful. It needs to be read out loud because it combines so many languages. And I mean, I kind of facetiously once recommended Krazy Kat to a friend, saying, well, if you imagine it's James Joyce's Itchy and Scratchy, but I'm not altogether wrong there, because the language predates Finnegan's Wake, but it's very, very Joycean. It does. Herriman was doing that before Finnegan's Wake, and the language is this incredibly poetic thing that needs to be read aloud to be truly appreciated. But you've got this cat who does this, annoys the mouse to such an extent that the mouse lobs a brick at the cat's head to vent their frustration, and which the cat always interprets as a missile of affection, and it's a beaning, and it's a love note sentiment. And the dog pines for the cat and tries to arrest the mouse to protect the cat. I mean, it's a bizarre setup for any menage a trois, but he works it so brilliantly and plays this dynamic, this kind of brick-based menage a trois.
Well, it's also an upsetting of the power balance, because cats are known to kill mice, and dogs, are generally bigger than cats. And so we have the most powerful one in terms of emotionally is Ignatz the mouse, who's borderline psychopathic.
Absolutely. I would, I think nowadays, we would label them as, psychotic maybe, or
antisocial personality.
Anybody who responds to challenging people by throwing bricks at their head is, somebody who really society needs protecting from. But it works wonderfully well. There's a poetry to this dynamic. Don't try it at home, kids. But it's magnificent.
Let's move on to George Herriman, who he was, as mentioned earlier. He was part black. He grew up, I think he was born in Louisiana. And I actually did a recent show with a woman who found out her background wasn't what she thought it was ethnically. Herriman grew up in that era where we had things like octoroons, quadroons, mulattoes, all these ridiculous terms for, he's got 1/16 Cherokee blood, but he's got 3/8, Negro, and therefore he's not white or something. For most of the contemporary photographs, I mean, Herriman is a little darker skinned. He always wore a hat, seemingly because he had curly hair. But, obviously he could pass for most people. You mentioned, I think, was it Tom? You mentioned the biography, or maybe it was David, the recent biography. What new insights do we know about Herriman? Because when we talk in the next segment about the actual strip, we're going to talk about gender and racial stuff within there. But what do we know more about Herriman that we didn't in the last few years?
Sorry, David,
The bio, gathers this information, but in a sense, you don't get a picture of his life. There's no diary beyond. Everything is in the script. We don't have why he wanted to pass. It's self-evident. That doesn't require any further explanation. He was a sociable person. He hung out. Whatever drama he had, they didn't seem to be disturbing or alcoholic or things like that. Everything is in the strip. And so, well, I'm glad that the bio was written. I don't know that it changes anything, because again, you see, going back to what we were saying the strip is so peculiar and so marvelous, and it works. But you see how this relates to his personality. I don't know.
I think, David, you're right, and I think there was always a shortage of, there was no trove of correspondence between Herriman and his wife to kind of shine a light on his domestic situation. We just know, we have second-hand, third-hand account that he was a family guy. They go on holiday to the real Coconino County, and the setting of Krazy Kat. So out in Nevada, there were family holidays. A lot of it's inference, a lot of it is observations from other journalists. When he was interviewed, or he was notoriously good at deflecting questions with humour, or in the persona of the cat, or so he was quite a private man. And of course, we have, I think it was in the early 1971, I think, when the whole birth certificate issue occurred, where somebody was looking to write and wanted to write a piece about Herriman, a journalist, I think, and located the birth certificate, 1880, I think he was born, and and on the birth certificate it was C for the period was coloured, but that's, and of course his death certificate, he was represented as Caucasian. So there was there's that element. I think he was, it was Louisiana, wasn't it? He was born. It was the, I've gone blank on the town, but he, and his family moved to LA when he was fairly young, I believe, and of course, this is an era where, again, as Dan was saying, you have this, this endemic racism and awful language would be used by our standards, and to get a job in a newspaper bullpen, in a newspaper empire that was often outing people for being off colour. I think it's easy to maybe judge Herriman with the benefit of hindsight, or it was maybe white passing. We don't know enough, I think, biographical details to do that. But he lived in the era he lived in, and it must have been very difficult. And I think a lot of the conflict he may have experienced internally, as you say, David, it was represented in the strip, and there's a lot of. One of the great things about Krazy Kat, unlike a lot of the comic strips of the era, is the fact that because it's animal cast, and is the fact and we mentioned the cat, the dog, and the mouse, but there were other denizens that would be brought into the strip over time. But it was all animal based. The Joe Stork, or there was the coyote I mentioned earlier. Colin Kelly was another dog. He was a brick deal.
In fact, that it said in the Native American territory, that's a big part of this whole trip.
Yeah. I think, by and large, though, unlike a lot of the comic strips that were the more kind of soap opera comic strips, the nature of Krazy Kat meant it doesn't have those kind of awful racial stereotypes that you would see in many comic strips of the era that might make them difficult for modern readers to deal with. Krazy doesn't, but race is there, and you've got a black cat and a white mouse, and sometimes that changes, and sometimes due to some instance in a narrative, you have a black mouse and a white cat, and there. From that kind of role reversal, there are scenes in Krazy Kat, and there are episodes in Krazy Kat where, in his own very kind of Herriman way, he does seem to be commenting on race. He does seem to be commenting on social issues, and we haven't even talked about the fact that we've got a cat of indeterminate gender here.
Well, I did want to bring that up, the sex and gender thing, because Crazy Cat is, I probably would say, 85% of the time referred to in the feminine, and maybe there's 10 or 15% that the masculine. Now, people have, obviously, with the race thing, you mentioned the birth certificate. Do we know if Harriman was bisexual or had any sexual confusion or anything like that?
I've seen nothing about that, but nothing. I don't. I think again the backside of it, but your question pushes me forward in a nice way. Is that so many artists? I mean, look, take Picasso, because there's been all this brouhaha recently about the last volume of John Richardson. Well, you couldn't say anything about Picasso without talking about very personal. I mean, the artist is so personal. He leaves a woman and so forth. There it is, you know. But with Harriman, you see, my feeling when the bio finally appeared was thinking that this information, I read it, but it didn't change anything about how I saw the strip. Because the strip, I mean, in a sense, it's kind of formal. You got these three characters, and they can do different things, and you can have outsiders. And in a sense, again, the model is something like Seinfeld, you know, where you have four people, but then someone else can come into the apartment, and someone else can come. And does it help to know anything about, you know, the character? Well, maybe it helps in Seinfeld. Does it help with Krazy? I don't know. In a sense, I mean, I just, to put it as a challenge, what would it mean to find anything about Harriman, a diary or a friend, or that would change how we see the strip? I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's always a red herring when you try to put biography in art. I mean, clearly, if you're writing a poem about your own cat, but but you think it's about Operation Barbarossa, there's going to be a disconnect there.
Yeah, I think from what I know and from what I've read, there's no indication of that Harriman was gay or bi, but we don't, you know, there's not enough. There's an absence. I mean, I think the biography we've referred to from, I think, 2017. I mean, it was what was great about it, I think, is that there was a rigor to the research. You know, they weren't just going to repeat third-hand accounts. So some of the things that I've repeated, and because I've heard enough times and read enough times, and read this biography where it was kind of questioned. Well, actually, there's no first person account. There's no primary evidence to support that. So there was a very thorough attempt at what do we really know? How can we prove? And the result is, in some ways, we know less than we knew before. I think almost because, you know, some of the myths were debunked a bit, so that left us knowing less certainty than we had before. I think there's an interesting anecdote in terms of, we're talking about Krazy's gender. There's an interesting anecdote where Frank Capra, the great American filmmaker Frank Capra, It's a Wonderful Life guy, was another influential, huge Krazy Kat fan, and basically took Harriman to task on the topic. Because tell me, is he a guy or a girl? You know, effectively, he wanted an answer, and Harriman said, there's no straight answer to that. You know, it's Krazy's like a sprite, like an elf. I'm paraphrasing here, but like a sprite, like an elf. Sometimes male, sometimes female, but you know, beyond male and female. Yeah. I don't think this was the 1920s, maybe the 1930s. If you consider how somebody making that kind of remark nowadays can incite, you know, a riotous anger and righteous indignation in some quarters. It's amazing that conversation was taking place in a time that we consider to be prehistoric. I find that interesting, but the Capra conversation comes to mind, and you can, I'm paraphrasing, but yeah, sprite and elf,
Well, it
beyond
also
my grade.
diminishes the role of the artist when you try to read too much biographically into it, because that says that because Harriman was of mixed race, or that he couldn't write about, things to the white world, because I'm a white male, I only have to write about white male heterosexual things. The part, I mean, any artist, the imagination is what defines them the most, not their physical body. And to try to say, well, he was making some grand artistic statement about sexuality in a 1928 daily strip when such and such happened. Uh, Basically, I mean, he was going more for the laughs, maybe a little bit more sophisticated laughs than the Three Stooges, but still, it's a comic strip. It's about comedy and little interpersonal situations.
But I think here the hardest, at least for me to touch on, is that there's peculiar isolation to Harriman and fame. What I mean is this: is that if you think of any of the composers or the painters or the movie makers of the period, well, they had descendants, and so people took the forms and modified them and did other things with them and varied them, and so they've become part of the tradition. Whereas the weird thing about Harriman and comics in general is that it's so big in the culture, but it's isolated. Is there any successor to Harriman? I mean, there may be people doing it, and I'm really not current on the fact that things move online. But my sense is that it's this mammoth work of art that's isolated. And as I mentioned earlier, that there were these various art world cases of people painting versions, and maybe they were interesting, but you didn't feel that had really anything to do with this triangle that we're talking about here. So it's a very peculiar bit of art, and I think we just don't have that idea there could be an art form that blossoms instantly and becomes enormous, but then doesn't lead you to anything else. I mean, think how different films would be if film had somehow died and we said, well, Godfather 3, that was the last film. I mean, kind of it. And
What a way to go.
we could look we could look at Godfather 1 and Godfather 2, but that's it. There's nothing more. And he said that would be that would change how we would think of this medium, but that's the story of Krazy.
Well, immediately what comes to mind when you said that, I mean, certainly within the last 20 or 30 years, Burke breathes Bloom County, in a sense, a spiritual success, even more so than Calvin and Hobbes, as good as that was. The Far Side also has a few elements, but that's just usually you're seeing the punchline of a joke that happens off camera, in a sense. And as far as, I mean, and I'll just ask you, because you probably know a lot more about the state of comic strips today. Is there anything that's online that has taken the online world by storm, or are comic strips sort of a relic of the 20th century in a sense?
And I don't know. I don't. I think. You're pointing exactly to why this is such an interesting issue. But let's go back. If the comic strip in its origin was this thing I mentioned about weak literacy and need to put these, after all, these go in the newspaper, which had newspapers. I live in a city that doesn't have a daily printed newspaper anymore. Not amazing.
Mm.
So the comic fits into a certain kind of moment of history. And how is everything going to change? The only model I can give, and this may sound like a crazy one, it drives my wife nuts, is during COVID, the combination of COVID plus Netflix meant that you didn't go out to a movie anymore, but you watched it here on your computer. And I remember there was one guy in the local newspaper who said, I went to a movie, and he reported this, after COVID, kind of event. Well, I mean, I walked into a place, there were other people there too, had popcorn, we set it up, a room with strangers. But so, there's these dramatic cultural changes. For comics to come back, wouldn't you need the newspaper to come back? The paper newspaper?
It's a funny thing, this period we're living in. If you talk about movies, we're talking about comics. And I know we're talking about newspaper comic strips here. And yeah, you're right. We're in a period where the print newspaper is struggling. We have, where the town I grew up in and lived in, it's what used to be the local newspaper of note is basically reduced to copying and pasting articles it finds on Facebook. And that's the depth of journalism there. This is not great because, there was a time when it would take corrupt councillors to task and so forth, So comics aren't going to thrive in that sector, but we're also living in a period, and I know this is very different, where I hate the term IP, right? Intellectual property. I hate it. It really gets my back.
Yeah, I hate content.
Your content. Oh, that's another one. Yeah, please. Don't reduce it to.
Or when an adjective like creative becomes a noun. You're not a creative if you call yourself a creative. That's not particularly creative.
Hey, that's a whole other show.
Yeah.
Hey, but words that irrationally annoy the bejesus out of me. And content, IP, and BO in terms of box office as the only measurement of a movie's success. Anyway, be that as it may, we're living during a period where comic-based ideas, stories are dominating the global kind of, well, certainly the Hollywood, and it's not just the obvious superhero ones, with whether it's the Marvel, DC superhero things, and I think Martin Scorsese may have a point there, but anyway, it's not just that, but a lot of movies, really fun movies, were based on comics, and people don't realise. The Death of Stalin. I don't know if any you gentlemen have seen from a few years ago.
Yeah.
Terrific film. That was based on a French comic. There's a lot of History of Violence, the film by what's his name, Canadian filmmaker. I've gone blank on. From maybe a decade or so ago.
Guy.
Scanners. Cronenberg.
Okay.
Sorry, my obviously need more coffee. But the Cronenberg film, History of Violence, that was based on a comic. So comic-based narratives are, everywhere. And yet comics themselves are really struggling. Comic books are struggling, to connect. I think there is a lively online comic audience.
A model from my field, art criticism, would be this, that over the past, very specialized kind of journalism, but over the past few years, basically all of the old art journals that were hard copy have folded or been reborn, but in new forms. But what the criticism has moved to is online. And then we have a couple of sites that I write for, the Book of Rail, Hyperallergic, and there's another one, Two Coats of Paint. And it's very interesting because if you think about the technology, you say, look, if your ambition is that you have a review of a show or an exhibition to appear while that show is up, then online is your dream, because you can reasonably say to the critic, look, the show opened November 1st, I want your review by November 15th, and it's going to appear on November 17th. And that's this kind of a dream that then makes it's very hard to realize that dream in a hard copy, because with printing, there you go. So that's an example, you see, of a venerable kind of journalism that goes back to Diderot in the 18th century. It looks like it's being just pushed out, and there are other economic concerns. So with comics, my question, and I'm too ignorant to answer it, but playing with Tom's thought here is, what would there be someone who really uses the online technology? Who's not just, in other words, I'm saying drawing strips and then putting them up so that we say, well, all right, I look on Google and here I got her strip, and this is one, there's 1, 2, 3. But it's really using, you see, the technology in some kind of way that I don't know what it would look like. I mean, I'll know it when I see it. But this, in a way, you see, is very much like Krazy, because who, knowing about, in a general way, about immigrant culture in New York, who would have envisaged the comic strip in 1913? It would have taken tremendous imagination, because you're, well, you mean that because these people, their English isn't very good, they're going to want pictures of little pictures telling stories and a cat and a mouse?
Yeah, yeah. And again, going back to an earlier point, it's still what's interesting about that period in 1913. So I think the preceding the Dingbat family I mentioned, that was from maybe 1910, and that's where Krazy and Ignatz first made their debut in the bottom of the page. But this is a period where the whole language of comic strips is being invented on the hoof, by people, and I've not mentioned Winsor McCay, Little Nemo, and Slumberland. Yeah, they I'm sure, were working in the same bullpen together, Herriman and Winsor McCay. I'm pretty sure.
I think Little Nemo was more about spectacle within the strip, whereas character was more important to Herriman.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I love the Little Nemo strips, and they are gorgeous to look at. Herriman was doing something very different, and there's whereas there's a kind of ornate quality to Little Nemo. But the point I'm trying to make, I suppose, is these two very different strips were going on in the same studio at some points, at opposite ends of the same studio. Two very different, very ornate Little Nemo in Slumberland, and You're Krazy, which is done with such an economy of line. You've got Ignatz mouse. His feet and arms are just a line, it's just an L shaped.
I think there were two.
And yet, there is a kinetic movement and a clarity of action.
You needed an art school training, so people knew how to draw, and they could draw quickly.
Mm-hmm.
They'd done the kind of figure drawing, and you needed an editor who could recognize and take from a primitive pitch and say, well, this is going to work. Because, of course, the thing that must have been the case, a lot of people must have tried to do this and to just see it wasn't going to work. Because, I mean, I think, successful comic strips people did well. I mean, you could make a good living. Herriman was reasonably well paid. He wasn't as rich as some. So it was a very peculiar kind of moment that it must have been very interesting to be sitting there and to be an editor, and you have to figure out, someone has a plan, and does this plan going to work? See, again, I keep coming back, not that I'm any expert on Seinfeld, but that must have been a strange TV thing to pitch and say, well, it's really about nothing. And imagine someone sitting there behind the desk and say, well, thank you.
Of course, going back, I do love Seinfeld. That's the notion of the pitch actually became a plot line of Seinfeld when the characters of Seinfeld were pitching a sitcom to the network. And of course, they didn't get a green light fictionally. They didn't get the green light that the real people did. But yeah, I think that's an interesting. There is a parallel there between the Jerry and Kramer and George and Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Elaine character, in that infinite possibility of permutation of playing those characters off with the bullpup, Krazy, Ignatz thing. I think I can see that. Well, parallel there.
Well, you mentioned that the strip ended with Herriman's death. So did it have a final strip or what? Did it just end? Because that suggests a kind of circularity. Like something like Gilligan's Island never had a farewell. They did a couple of bad TV movies 15 years later, but Gilligan's Island has this very Beckett-like thing where the whole every show is they try to get off the island. Gilligan fucks things up. and you wonder why don't they just kill Gilligan? You know,
There's a pattern. Nobody notices.
I hate this advertisement for myself, but if you look at my review of the book on hyper Bridget, I think we reprinted there the last scene, and it is kind of interesting because it is a death scene of Krazy. I mean, rounds. But to answer the question in a more interesting way, but you see, it's like Seinfeld. There's no development because God, I sound like I haven't seen Seinfeld for a long time, but what do you know in Seinfeld? You can't have anyone get married. You can't have anyone have children. You can't have anyone do any of the things of development because if you have a baby, then the baby becomes a toddler, then becomes a student, and then you need to incorporate change and so forth. So you have these characters that, however the actors may age, they keep doing the same things, right? And it's also that they never learn from experience. Isn't that the point of that? I mean, this is not a Bildungsroman. This is not going anywhere. And does the mouse ever learn to be wiser? No. I mean, that would violate the...
But that's also part of the human condition. Just look at Palestine, Israel. My whole life, it's the same thing. An attack here, Israel responds. This, that, and nothing ever gets solved. You look at every 4 years in the voting here in the U.S. This is we've got to vote for this party. We got to make America great. We've got to say that, and nothing really fundamentally changes.
Yeah, the cycle repeats endlessly, alas. Yeah, we'd like to think.
Or maybe it's just even an illusion of a cycle, I don't know.
Yeah. I always think there was a famous, there's a phrase that has always been attributed to Stanley, maybe misattributed to Stanley. I'm pretty sure he said it about his approach to comics. And it was about not about change, but the illusion of change. But I sometimes think, hey, that's life, isn't it? That's the human condition. Do we change, or is it just the illusion of change? And certainly, that was a takeaway from Krazy Kat. That cycle kept repeating, but with beautiful, beautiful permutations.
Yeah, in a novel, a character develops and changes, and leaving aside the political things that you're into. Whereas in the strip, I mean, there's no room for development because I would think that in a lot of cases you could put Krazy. I mean, we're talking about 30 years, right, or more. You could put an early one and a late one. And I don't think I could pull them out in any kind of order, except if they refer to some political event and footnote saying that this was the 1928 whatever, bank robbery or something, something particular. I think it is a completely static world, and that can be charming, but of course at the same time as you're hinting that it can be limited.
Well, the thing with change, just to go back to the comics themselves. I mean, how many years, even longer, 50 years, Charlie Brown still wouldn't be able to kick that goddamn football, and he'd always fall for Lucy's entreaties.
Yeah. How long did it take for Lois Lane to work out that glasses and were not a perfect disguise? Again, it's comics. It's we've got the and animation and other mediums that don't involve real living human critters.
Let me just ask you, you brought it up, because there were a few animated Krazy Kat cartoons. Do either you want to speak on that?
I know of them. I've seen bits of them. Herman wasn't involved. Most are just funny animal cartoons that lack what I've seen. It was during at the height of the strip's popularity, which I think was the 1920s. Some of these short, there was silent animated shorts. Some hewed more closely to the Herman dynamic than others. Some were almost unrecognizable. I think there was an animated show from the 50s and 60s, perhaps, that and then they in terms of the gender of the cat, they couldn't decide, and one show, of course, this wasn't a problem with the silent versions, but when there was talkies, then you would have one version where it's a female Krazy
Yeah.
or a male Krazy in another. But they're not great. The ones I've seen are not, you go to the comic strip, they're not great. And Herriman wasn't involved in the animated stuff.
I mean, the newspaper comes, you look through the news, the
Mhm.
various strips, the various different ones, compare with the others, and then you go to the next page, and then the next day, you get another, right? So there's a sense that there are all these things in between, but it's very different. I mean, look, if you read Proust and you read 2 pages and there's a phone call, and then you read 2 pages and then there's a TV, and then there's, I mean, you never get anywhere. In Proust, you wouldn't have a sense of continuity, but the comic strips, they are this art of this interruption, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like you would expect anyone on Friday to think, what was happened on Thursday? But what was back Monday? Appealing to the old newspapers, because they don't work like that. I mean, when you look at these reprintings of them, you don't feel that you have to go back to understand what's on page 130. What's on page 130 then leads to what's on 32, but it's a very specific.
Well, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going. One of the things with Krazy, I think it's worth pointing out. I don't think we've actually mentioned this. We've talked about the foreground characters. We're talking about the dynamic between the cat, the dog, and the mouse. Yeah, but in terms of continuity and in terms of the backgrounds, comic strips often attract people who really agonize over continuity. And certainly American superhero comic strips do. So a coloring error on the first issue of The Incredible Hulk has to be written into the narrative to explain why he was grey in the first issue and green in subsequent issues. And this has to be explained. And Herriman, Krazy Kat doesn't have that because the background would change from panel to panel. So, panel 1 is Krazy, and you can have Krazy and Ignatz stationary, okay? Something happens, and stationary in the second panel, but the background has changed. There was a mesa behind them, now there's a palm tree, now there's a house. It was constantly morphing, backdrop, even the background lacked continuity.
Well, one set in from the next, right? In the studio.
Yeah. And that's part of the charm. That was part of the charm, where the background was morphing and sometimes providing commentary in a way, ironic commentary on what was happening in the mouse, cat, dog shenanigans in the foreground. It's almost as if a potted plant would be, in that wonderful way that Herriman could create almost a reaction shot with 3 lines.
Yeah. And as you mentioned earlier, that it's also that you have those subsidiary characters who appear and occasionally reappear, but you see, they don't develop either. I mean, again, it's like Seinfeld. You don't expect that the soup guy is going to become gentle and loving. I mean, this is it is a world. It is a world of fixed identities, and there's something charming about that, but also, of course, limiting, because it's a world where nothing is going to go anywhere. It can't. It's not like Krazy's going to build a house.
Yeah.
Or
Krazy in the suburbs.
Yeah. There's no.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I will link to David Carey, artwriter.com, and tomlennon.com. Let me just get a final word from both of you. David, is there anything else you wanted to add that we didn't?
This is just wonderful. I thank both of you because it reminds me how much fun I had. Damn it, I'm going to find Krazy and start reading it again. Thank you both.
Okay. Tom, do you have a final thought?
Yeah, again, it just encouraged me to revisit the Krazy Kat volumes. I recommend the Fantagraphic collections because they're great. They're affordable, because that was the problem. A lot of the times, the out-of-print stuff was prohibitively expensive, but the Fantagraphic stuff is still in print, I believe, and you get a good read. Each one contains 2 years worth of Sunday strips, so it's terrific stuff, and that's a good place to start, I think, with the Sunday strips, because I think, in my opinion, that's Herriman at his purest, because he wasn't tied into the 3 or 4 boxes of the daily strip. And at times he would have a whole canvas to express his wonderful idiosyncratic and very unique artistic vision. So yeah,
He's a marvelous.
have a look at Sunday Pages if you want to see Herriman in action, I would say. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you both.
Thanks for organizing.
Thanks for having us, Dan.